let's go ahead and get started. This is Tricia Jones-Parkin with Center for Persons with Disabilities at Utah State University. We're really excited to bring you this 4-part webinar series. So welcome to the first module, The Importance of Employment. We are going to be talking about really kind of giving an orientation to the history of employment for people with disabilities and the relationship to Utah policy and services. And then we're also going to have an introduction from DSPD leadership, the director, Angie Pina. But first I'm going to turn the time over to John Butterworth, who's going to kind of just go through a little bit of the how-tos and tips in navigating the Adobe platform. John?
Sure. Hi, everybody. This is John Butterworth. I'm with the Institute for Community Inclusion at UMass Boston, and here today with my partner, Janine Zalaki from the National Association of State Directors of Developmental Disability Services. Just a couple of notes as we get started. We encourage you to chat in the chat pod on the left. That's in the bottom left corner. That will get a little bigger as we get fully started, so you'll have plenty of room to type. There are resources for download. That pod is going to go away in a second, but we'll come back at the very end of the broadcast. And two last notes. If you need technical support for any reason, there's an email address that'll stay there throughout the session. So feel free to email Sheila, or you can direct a question directly to the hosts by using the little down arrow in the upper right-hand corner of the question and comments tab and pick a specific person. Lastly, this will be recorded and will be available to come back to later, including downloading those resources. So welcome, and I'll hand it over to Angie to get us started.
Thank you, John and Trish. So the first thing we're going to talk about a little bit is just DSPD and employment. Some of it I wanted to talk about was just our employment values. To start, we really prioritize strengths-based approaches for all of our services, and that applies to competitive integrated employment. We really believe that people deserve the opportunity to work, and it's up to us to gain knowledge and skills to support people, not to put limitations on who can and cannot. It's really got to be up to that person. So also we believe that paid work is an essential part of having control over the life you want, and that it leads to personal and professional growth, and it opens doors to new social opportunities for people. A little bit about how employment has influenced our system. Many of you may be aware in 2011, Representative Menlove, independent of anyone, she has a family member with a disability, wanted to make our state an employment first state. So for anyone who is not familiar with that, it just means that employment should be the first option and preferred option for people with disabilities when they are receiving assistance from publicly funded systems. It's about real jobs with real wages. So she reached out to Trish to help develop what this legislation should look like. And in fact, our state was one of the first states to have any employment first legislation, and other states modeled after ours. It's really a central part of like our initiatives, our processes, and our programs. We've also, it's impacted us in getting the partnership with the Office of Disability and Employment Policy, as well as applying for the Partnership and Employment Grant, which started with us and is now at Utah State University. So it stayed with Trish wherever Trish was. And finally, we know that employment is impacted within the settings rule. Right, when someone is in an integrated setting with peers, with or without disabilities, right, that's the idea, is that settings are about the community, and we want people to access what anyone else can. And the final thing is that employment is really the great equalizer. both financially, socially, and with self-worth. And when we think about what it does for ourselves, it's the same for people we serve. The next slide, I just wanted to point out that even in the 1940s, when the Utah State Training School started, part of what they did was employment-type services, and this was 80 years ago. So yes, it was institutional, it's set up as an institution, but you can see people are sewing, crocheting, they were doing carpentry, shoeing horses. I thought that was relevant just to think that limitations weren't being put on people. There wasn't the consideration that if you have a disability, you can't shoe a horse. It was really, so 80 years ago, right, 1940s. So if we look kind of how things have evolved, we know that since between then and 2011, we had supported employment happening. But in 2011, we really were focusing on like how to, what employment looks like for people with disabilities. It also is when, so we have our Employment First legislation initiated then, and it's also when we started our supported work independence program for people who are on the waiting list. So right now we have several people on the waiting list receiving employment support. From that, once that legislation was developed, we worked with Voc Rehab, education, substance abuse and mental health to develop a statewide plan. You guys can kind of read through all of this on your own. I'm just going to do some highlights. In 2013, something that I think was relevant is Trish working with a provider support coordinator in school district did our first kind of demonstration project, which I believe was helpful in us getting the partnership with the Office of Disability and Employment Policy in 2014, because we were able to demonstrate already some background, some insight into what can be done. It's the same year that the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act was passed as well, so vocational rehabilitation was starting to look at what that meant for them. 2015 had a direct impact on us when vocational rehabilitation had to move to order of selection. Hopefully you all know that they're out of the order of selection now. They worked hard to get services moving quickly. It's also when we started an initial school to work project, which benefited us when applying for the Partnership in Employment grant in 2016. And then in 2017, we had that Office of Disability Employment Policy partnership. So they were funding a consultant to work with us. In 2017, the service descriptions were finalized. The reimbursement structure was developed. We coordinated with Voc Rehab so that we were trying to have similar expectations and compensation. And I think what I really want to show with this timeline that Trish put together when she worked here, thanks Trish, is that we've looked at how to build capacity in our system, what kind of system changes needed, and have built upon that across the years to strengthen our system, to get the resources, to get the skills and the knowledge necessary. And that's what really brings us to this webinar, is we know that we wanted to get this to support coordinators as well. And I really appreciate Trish and the TA Center and the work that they did, just their insight, their innovation, and their work to get this put together for support coordinators, since you're such a relevant part of our system and in helping people achieve meaningful goals and dreams in their lives. So if you look at more recent initiatives in employment, the past 3 years, if you count this upcoming legislative session that starts next week, the governor's budget has requested funding for employment services based on the support and research done with the Office of Disability and Employment Policy, which also included stakeholders and input in developing those. In 2018, we completed a legislative study on employment, specifically around youth, employment-aged youth who are going to be transitioning out of school, so youth and young adults. This was requested by our legislative committee. 3 key points that came out of that is feedback was to make the Interagency Disability Employment Council permanent. So right now that exists under the grant. It also, recommendations were to offer incentivized flexible employment service options and to build education employment transition capacity in the school system. In 2018, we also joined the State Employment Leadership Network, who is with us today doing this presentation. Some of the things we've been focusing on is making sure the message of employment and the benefits of employment are out there so that people are informed, whether, not just people we're serving, but our system, so that we're all informed about what's possible. And also to develop strategies to increase the profile of employment in the person-centered planning process. So we have several support coordinators on that group, helping to inform and develop that so that the planning system, so we've improved the resources there and that it's responsive and something that's easy for all of you to use. It's really been a diversified work group as well. The final thing that work group is doing is helping us with settings rule compliance. As we improve resources for the planning process, so some of that is charting the life course, some of it is developing the employment questionnaire. It's going to help everyone in developing goals and supports around that person. And then just a little bit of data. If you look, we have definitely dedicate funding to the number of people receiving employment services. Something interesting to consider is that even with our growth in employment services, it has not increased at the same rate that people have come into services. So that ratio is not equal. However, if you look at the next slide, that first graph, the gray bar is Utah and the blue bar is the national average. This comes from the National Core Indicators Project. So that first question is, it just looks in USEPs at how many people have an employment goal in their service plan. And you can see that the trend in Utah over the past 3 years has been an increase, which I credit to just people having more of those conversations, being more informed. And you can see that our average is higher than the national average, so kudos to the work you guys are doing. And then the next question is, it says, would like a paid job in the community. So I just want to make sure you understand this. People first express that they don't have a paid job in the community, and then there's a follow-up question of if they would like one in the community. So this is really just looking at those who want to work in the community. It's a subset of the people we serve. And we kind of want this trend to go towards zero, because we want people who want to work in the community to have jobs. We're not specifically concerned about the increase, because even though we kind of have had an increase, we're not going down towards zero right now. Some of that we expect will happen as people get more informed about job opportunities, about what they can do. So we realize that it may not just be kind of a steady trend. There might be some spikes as we keep moving forward in this. So just want to say thanks to Trish, the TA Center, and SELN for this webinar, and I'll turn the time back over to John.
Actually, to Janine to get us started. A couple of people had trouble hearing me, so let me know if this is better. But Janine, I'm going to give it to you.
Sure. Hi, everybody. This is, as John said, Janine Zalaki from the National Association of State Directors of DD Services, and we're really happy to be here with you today. I'd like to first say that I hope all of you know that this is the first of 4 webinars. Today's webinar is on the importance of employment, followed by the preceding month, the employment conversation. Webinar 3 will be on the employment and the ISP, and we will follow with the 4th and final webinar on the employment process. So just indicating what webinar we're starting with today. In terms of webinar objectives, John and I really want to assist you so that you're able to assist the people you support, their families, and any other community member in understanding the positive impact that work has on a person's quality of life. The second objective that we have for today's webinar is for you to, again, help the people that you support and their families in really understanding how changes today in policies, regulations, and services and supports, and Angie did a super job in lining out the employment context in Utah. So those services and supports that really emphasize the exploration of employment. Oops, sorry about that. So let's go into the importance of employment. This first slide is a wordle that we like to use, and you know, at first glance, this wordle describes the many, many benefits for work for all of us. Things jump out like professionalism, network, knowledge, relationship. And then in the practicality of it all, if you want anything, you have to work. You have to have an income. Work brings us all economic security. We learn from the work that we do and all of the people that we work with. And it really helps us to build a social network amongst our peers and the community. And as we all know, the greater our personal social network is, the more likely we are to feel a sense of belonging. So there are a couple values that I'd like to lay out that really ground the employment conversation. Number one, work is an expectation and a norm for adults in our society. Quite frankly, right, it's a norm for many, many young adults. It's a natural part of our human experience. It's a civil right. The Americans with Disabilities Act lays that out. Everyone should make an informed choice about employment. Competitive integrated employment is possible for all people. And people really need to have conversations and have the ability to foster a dignity of risk as they go about their day-to-day life. Oftentimes, when we're grounding this discussion about working, people will say, you know, why work? And I've laid out so many of those positive qualities about why people work. We have opportunities for learning and relationship building, which then in turn, you know, you're working, it gets people out of poverty. People have more independence. We all feel very independent in the jobs that we have. Some of my closest and dearest friends throughout my life have come from different positions that I have held and jobs that I have held. We all make a contribution to our communities. We have a positive image and a valued role when we go to our job every day. And it really gives us opportunities for learning, different levels of learning, and as I said, building those close relationships. And, you know, people with disabilities want the same opportunities to show all of their skills and talents and to be recognized as valuable contributing members of their communities. And today, we have the knowledge to provide services and supports to even those with the most significant disabilities to become employed in the competitive labor market with and without job support. There are many, many, many success stories and many people working across the country. Oh, goodness, John. I have a trigger finger going. So as a priority area, oftentimes we get the question, does everyone have to work? We want to share with you that really our focus today should be on how do we get the rate of disabled working adults really closer to that rate of non-disabled working adults, which is about 75%. You know, we need to focus on that instead of always asking the question that comes up, does everyone have to work? People with disabilities in general, as you are probably very well aware, have lower employment rates than those without disabilities, and people with cognitive disabilities have an even greater rate of unemployment. So we really cannot continue to focus our efforts on whether everyone can work, because we know already that people with significant disabilities can and do work and earn a living wage. We really want to focus our attention on that idea that I said before of closing the gap for all of those things that are on that slide that we talked about. And further, why wouldn't we want to try to get people working so that more individuals that we support have the opportunity to gain and maintain employment, really in light of all the social and economic pressures that we all face in society today. John?
Thanks. I'm going to switch screens for just a second here and start with a short video from some of our partners from Green Mountain Self-Advocates. They've worked with us to help understand employment from a job seeker and an employee's point of view, and particularly helped us to think about what it means to provide good support. Hang on just a second. I will note, if you are on the phone, and there are a couple of people who are, this you need to listen to over your computer's audio.
I have a quote from a good colleague of mine, Nicole LeBlanc, and she says, "Unfortunately, many people with disabilities grow up in the shadows of low expectation syndrome. Our hopes and dreams can be stripped away by doctors, teachers, parents, and providers who have preconceived notions about what we are capable of doing."
Let your job coach know what your dream is and what your dream job is.
Presume competence. And what we mean by presuming competence is when you meet a person with a disability, assume they are capable. You know, don't assume that someone can or can't do things, but, you know, make sure that they tell you what they need for accommodations and then give them the chance to be in the driver's seat.
If you're interested, there's a longer version of that on the website that's on here, thinkwork.org, and I'd encourage you to go look for it. You know, the critical point that Angie made earlier to me comes from some of the national core indicators data. We know nationally that about 19% of people who get services from a state IDD agency are working in an integrated job, and only about 14% are working in an individual competitive integrated job. But we also know from national core indicators that almost half of the people, it's the 46% in the second pie chart here, almost half of the people tell us that they want a job in the community. Nationally, that's some 240,000 people. We've got lots of people to work with. And this is the role of case managers, and Utah's data looks pretty good in this respect. Nationally, of those people who want a job, only about 43% indicate that they have a job in their service plan. On a national level, it means we need to listen better and hear what people are saying and then create a clear pathway, clear action steps that tie to that. And that's very much grounded in the role that each of you have as a support coordinator. Janine, back to you.
I'm going to talk a little bit about self-determination because it is key and very relevant to our discussion about employment and making informed choices. Self-determination is critical for all people receiving supports, whether you are self-directing your services in the waiver or you're not. It can be a balancing act, though, between supporting you and making sure that you're safe, and also making sure, as I stated before, that people have the ability to make decisions and have dignity of risk in their lives. The way that we can keep these two important factors aligned and balanced is by making sure anybody that you're supporting has the ability to make an informed choice. Making an informed choice is really critical. We all make them in probably everyday life, maybe a couple of times a day. I'm sure as you sit here and you listen to me talk about this, you can remember a time where you needed assistance from one of your trusted family or your friends in making a decision about something that you may know a little bit about, you may need it to have a deeper conversation about, or you just wanted the affirmation of talking over your decision and your options with someone that you loved or cared about. So supported decision-making is also another way that people that you're supporting can be afforded the opportunity to make informed choices if they indeed need help in any aspect of their life. And the fact remains is they decide through the supported decision-making process, asserting their self-determination and making that informed choice on what pieces of their life they may need that support. Part of having these conversations about, and John is putting up a poll at the same time I'm going to be discussing, having these conversations and really delving into making an informed choice starts to have you all thinking and we thinking about really how do we frame our questions, because it's really important how we frame these questions to really elicit responses and really for a person to become comfortable in answering the questions and moving them beyond a yes or no. So you choosing the questions you ask, number one, is a very careful thing to think about. Close-ended questions, and I'm sure you've all asked them in your time. I know I have done many of them as a support coordinator in my day for compliance purposes. Elicit yes or no answers. Do you want to work? Things like that really don't expand the conversation. And you're typically going to receive a yes, or a no, or maybe something very short and factual. Asking open-ending questions like the ones on your screen really elicit more complex answers that allow you to discover a person's knowledge, opinions, and feelings. These questions usually begin with a what, a why, or a how, and they really help you get unstuck. Looking at the poll and the answer to what areas within employment conversations are you getting stuck, a large majority of 63% talk about overcoming objections. I mean, that is an excellent area to start here, because family members may not understand the process of employment. Maybe need a little bit of support in really understanding the positive effects, the role that employment has on their benefits, and the family as a whole. So if you have these conversations using some of these open-ended questions, for instance, like what worries you about getting a job, These kinds of discussions really help you facilitate by engaging in conversations that not only clarify a person's interests and skills, but also help to alleviate some of those concerns with, creative thinking. There will always be, and I'm sure you all can attest to this, always be varied points of interest when you're supporting someone in their circle of support. Everybody has different concerns and belief systems, but the most important is listening to the voice of the person who you're engaging in to develop that person-centered plan. The main point that I really want to make here is that having guided conversations about employment really helps the person, the family, and the whole team process information. They can then, draw their own conclusions, but in the end, it really gets to helping that person make that informed choice. This is a graphic that we like to use to really lay out in a visual, and I'm sure there's so many more things that you all do, but it helps us to really lay out pieces of the role of a support coordinator or case manager. Your role, as you know, or a piece of your role, is to help the people you support really discover the benefits of employment, and to really help them identify a path to possibly fulfilling work in the community. As you're doing that, you are also fulfilling your obligations to be both the arm of that person and the arm of the state, right? In really fulfilling all of the person-centered planning requirements and the CMS rule requirements and, obligations that you have as a provider of case management services. So we know that you do all of that using some or all of the descriptors on the outside, such as communication, relationship building, rolling your sleeves up and getting really creative at times. This all has the potential to ensure that people with disabilities have the same opportunities for satisfying employment as anybody else. We have learned, and we have been doing a lot of work with case managers, that successful case managers really facilitate those conversations, with a variety of people who know that person best, along with the person, of course, first and foremost. And you really have an important role to play in helping that person identify and realize not only their employment opportunities and gains and what they're interested in, but really their full potential. As needs arise, you can reach out to the family and personal networks, and you're trying to tie all of that to people in the community, and all of these perspectives make the whole role of the case manager complete and involving the community and focusing on work. Team members, as you know, can ebb and flow. People could say they want certain team members today, change to other team members tomorrow. But as a case manager or a support coordinator, you are that constant in that person's life and can really help encourage progress and maintain focus.
So I'm an old school supported employment person, and supported employment emerged and was first defined in the 1980s. And we were pretty sure as supported employment emerged that it was going to become the dominant support that people received, and employment would be the dominant outcome people received. Really basic to those early conversations about supported employment was this idea that there are no prerequisites, that we can't assume that we know how successful people will be in the workplace, that until someone is in a workplace that has a good match for them, that fits their skills, fits their interests, fits the kind of environment they prefer to be in, then we really don't know how successful they're going to be. So we should not allow any barriers. If someone says they want to work, they ought to have a chance to try that. To me, that's where the 240,000 people who want to work is a really critical number to think about. That's a lot of people. And it's worth our coming back to this no prerequisites concept as we work our way forward. We're going to take a brief break for another video. This one is from our website, realworkstories.org. We're going to watch part of it. You can go back and watch more if you want. John's story is in a large part about collaborators in the employment process, and we'll come back to a poll question and a little discussion about who to bring to the table after we get through. But let me just switch to the video screen again.
Nominated John for a pilot project. John's service coordinator from the Massachusetts Department of Developmental Services nominated John for a pilot project whereby a team of professionals would be established and a series of planning meetings would take place to create and implement employment goals. Involved in these meetings were John's employment provider, a trained person-centered planning facilitator, his service coordinator, and his mother, who all worked together. As John's participation in his planning process evolved, it became clear that the team held a shared commitment to the goal of obtaining community employment and the expectation that John could and would find a competitive job that suited his needs. Ashley Wolf from the Institute for Community Inclusion visited John, his team of professionals, and his supervisor at Joann Fabrics.
Please tell me about your job and what you do here.
I collect yarn.
What else do you do?
Fabric, I think. Well, behind me here, all of this fabric, folding.
A folding?
Yeah.
You do folding? Okay. And when you fold, you also put away?
Yeah,
right?
put away all this yarn.
Yeah? That's a big job. I bet you like it.
Yep.
Do you?
Yep.
What do you like about your job?
So, I like yarn. Yarn. So I collect yarn. I put up, like up here. And so I punch in. So I punch out. I'm done.
What is it you do not like about your job?
I like it.
And what did you learn from this job?
Folding. We're clock in. Yeah, clock in. And also punch out.
What do they do to help you with your job?
Oh, they help me. Click all the yarn back there.
Okay, and then what do you do with the yarn?
Put in a cart right here.
Okay, and then what do you do next? You put away?
Yeah, so I put away.
You put away in the aisles?
Yep.
Okay. What do you like about your work?
I like my picture. So I collect yarn.
Well, that was it, and that was great. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks.
So tell me about what John does here. What does he contribute?
Well, he's great to work with. He basically takes care of stocks our yarn. He handles and straightens up all of our fabric for us. Pretty much takes care of red tag, make sure everything looks good.
Okay. What are John's strengths as an employee?
He's very friendly. He'll talk to guests. They'll ask him a question. He knows where to get help. He's great to talk to, and he always has a smile on his face.
I just wanted to point out that the entire team had one shared expectation, and that was that John would be successful in a community placement. And when we all got together and put our heads together, came up with some very unique solutions to help him achieve that. Susan as Ruth pointed out, was able to get John involved in other activities outside of the job search that really helped his personality come out more.
Well, I think with Susan Nadworthy, she got John involved in other things so that it complemented his job and made him want to work. And then with Deb, she kept checking on to see what was available for John and what John could succeed in also. And then the collaborative, they wanted John to succeed also, so they looked into a lot of different jobs for him. And myself, I just wanted John to work. I didn't care where he worked.
I think that, once again, so much work was done prior to us coming on. I think that everybody saw a different side of John, and everyone could point out a skill that he had, that it just became apparent that the match was here. Mom.
So I'd be curious if people have any particular things that stuck out for you as you watched the video in terms of John's situation, the people who were involved in helping him. And while you think about that, take just a minute to fill out, if I can open it up, this next poll. I'm curious who you've involved in the job planning that you've done. But if you have any thoughts or comments on the video, please throw them in the chat box down at the bottom. People are pretty consistently involving parents, and employment specialists is usually at the table. It's good to see that people's home staff are well represented. Quite a few of you are saying residential staff. A few people, siblings, and I've got to say I've been in a couple of situations where I was supporting someone around a job where the sibling was either a key pathway to a relationship that led to a job opportunity for the person. Other situations where the sibling was a key support around, giving them a ride to work or helping figure out something else. Some people said friends, both family friends and job seeker friends, and that's great. We don't always do a terrific job of bringing a person's full network of relationships into helping with the job search process. One of the key things I was listening, but I can't remember if it came out in this part of the video or if it's later. John's job was from a personal network. It was from a relationship that his mom had with people in that yarn store, and she opened a door to a conversation that then led to the job that John ended out in. Those relationships open up our opportunities, and as you support people, it's both who you bring into this planning and brainstorming process, but as you work with and pay attention to the work that an employment specialist is doing or a job developer is doing, also pay attention to how effectively they're reaching out to people in the person's network, looking for those kinds of contacts, looking for different ways to find entry into the workplace. Janine, back to you.
All right. So we saw some great personal stories of people sharing their jobs with us. And another question that comes up often is, what do people do when they're not working? When we think about expanding integrated community employment, we really need to recognize the link between employment and community engagement or community participation. That engagement or participation should really encourage individuals to become involved in typical activities that anyone else would be doing based on their own interests. Maybe they want to continue education. Maybe they want to do something out in the community that really helps to build on the employment skills that they have through their engagement in the community or through some volunteering opportunities. So the main thing to think about here is that community is relationships. It's not places. And this is a real hurdle in our thinking, because in the past, when people were moving from institutions into group homes in the communities in the 80s, it was a really critical and very important step. But community was defined kind of by those settings because they were in the community and not in an institution. Community is about your experiences and your connections. We really want to support people to become more engaged in their communities through activities that help to really broaden their social connections and help them build relationships with people who have, similar likes. They might meet people in a club they're in. They might bump into someone in a coffee shop and strike up a conversation and become friends. But it's really about what people experience on a daily basis. Community engagement is having a meaningful role in your community. It's community participation and engagement. It's not just being in the community. It's having support to access and participate in the community outside of employment. You're participating in experiences, though, that have the potential to lead to employment, just like us. You might be doing some career exploration. You might be doing some networking. You're engaging in activities possibly as a wraparound to employment to really have yourself a very meaningful everyday life. You're building social connections. You're engaging and you have engagement that supports even people who may be retiring, but you're supporting them in integrated ways. So in a nutshell, it's, like it is for everyone else. So we're going to take a couple minutes, and I'm going to turn this over to John, who's going to take us through a little bit about the evolution of employment policy.
So to some extent, policy and practice. To some extent, as I look back at my time in the employment field, I'd be curious if anyone here has ever watched a Mark Gold Try Another Way video or been involved in a Mark Gold activity. Mark died way too young in the 1980s, but he was really the father in many ways of supported employment. He was a master of systematic instruction. He taught us that you could teach pretty much anybody a complex task in a very short period of time if you were careful about how you taught it. Mark's signature task that he would teach as a demonstration was assembling a complex bicycle brake assembly. And in typically 20, 30 minutes, he would take someone who had never seen that task before and teach them to do it independently. That experience of Mark Gold and the demonstrations he gave us was really the heart of that no prerequisites ideal and value that developed and triggered supported employment. From Mark's demonstrations, we moved into early 1980s demonstrations of people working in employment settings. Some of those happened with Frank Rush in Washington State when he was in Seattle. They began to happen in other parts of the country like Virginia Commonwealth University, Oregon. We began to see more and more demonstrations of people working, and the concept of supported employment was first defined in the Developmental Disabilities Act in 1984, and then defined as a service, really the basis of the service we use now in the Rehabilitation Act, which governs vocational rehabilitation services. The late 1980s also triggered funding through the Rehabilitation Services Administration for systems change, or first efforts to do capacity building and training on a larger scale. We've continued to develop those ideas. So in the 1990s, we began to develop the idea of customized employment, that jobs didn't need to exist. There didn't need to be a want ad, but that we could build relationships with employers, figure out what they need, create a match to the specific interests and skills of people that we're working with. And as that process has become evolved and we've become more sophisticated in doing that kind of employment support, we've also moved out into areas like self-employment. The picture here is Dusty Dutton, who has a puppetry business. She works 2-3 days a week doing puppetry at preschools, where she's got kind of standing relationships, standing gigs as a performer, but also does birthday parties and community events, and as many starving artists do, has a wage job at a hotel that fills part of her time as well. We've demonstrated through that arc, starting with Mark's work into supported employment, to customized employment, to alternatives like self-employment. We've demonstrated that people can work in a wide range of businesses. One more video for you for today. This is a young woman who got a job as a swim instructor at a YMCA. A great example of a less typical job opportunity. And I'd ask you while you watch it to be thinking about the person you work with who has found a particularly unique job. You can use the questions and comments area to add that, but let us know examples of people you supported that got a job that you thought was really interesting, either because it was such a good match for them or because it was outside of the mainstream of the kind of jobs that people typically get.
My name is Lisa Ellis, and I'm working at YMCA in Fairfield.
Lisa is a certified lifeguard and swim instructor at the YMCA in Fairfield, Connecticut. As a lifeguard, Lisa tests chemical levels in the water and looks after swimmers by surveying the pool during swim sessions. As a swim instructor, Lisa prepares for class sessions and teaches group swim lessons. With support from her supervisor, coworkers, and family, Lisa earned and maintains the necessary certifications for her job, successfully carries out her work responsibilities, and has earned the reputation of being a responsible, detail-oriented, and dedicated employee at the YMCA.
I work in 4 days a week, plus Friday night I work. Okay, all of my boss and all of all my co-workers sponsor me working here. I take the supplies out for the class.
The supplies out for the classes.
And take training.
Take attendance.
And check chlorine and pH.
Check chlorine and pH, and most importantly, you watch the kids.
No, survey the scene under and above the water.
So survey the scene under and above the water.
Yes.
What did you used to do on the weekends? You used to come to Open Swim and do what? A long time ago, when your nieces were little.
I teach my niece swimming.
And I saw you teaching your nieces to swim.
Yes.
And I saw what a great job you were doing. And I said, maybe you would like to work at the Y.
Yes.
And then what did we have to do to be certified and work at the Y?
I knew be a lifeguard.
And that class is...
So what are some of the interesting jobs that you found for people? I may have to pull this out again. Hang on a second. I'm going to take that away. You can use the chat pod while I switch screens. Jobs you've been particularly excited about for people that you support. Oops, that's not working. Sorry about that. Caring for plants.
Is it that, this is Janine. Oh.
Oh, there we go. Caring for plants in an office building, a receptionist delivering mail, copies for patients, self-employed, making holiday crafts at retail stores, assistant activities director at a care center. That's pretty cool, running activities for residences. Working at a bank, we don't always think about what we typically think of as white collar jobs, and it's great to see us moving outside of that. Doggy daycare, following someone's dream, I suspect, of working with people. Folding pizza boxes. The critical thing is here is that we think about a full range of options, that we really listen to people's dreams. I love Lisa's story. It's a good example of people really listening and paying attention. Oh, Tricia, snake expert at a local specialty pet store. Yeesh. That's great. Working at a print shop, again, that's probably a less traditional kind of job, selling crafts, someone who's more self-employed. That's a pretty broad range. And that level of thinking, again, no prerequisites, think about the person's interests, follow that path, is really the key to making employment work. Thank you. I'm going to actually skip that. So we know that we can do this. We've demonstrated we can do it. We've been doing that since Mark Gold in the 1970s. We have struggled in making this move. Angie showed some data that suggests you guys are moving in that direction, and that's great. We are beginning to see movement on a national level. But this is a national trend of all-day services for people who get supports from a state IDD agency. Two things that are important about this particular chart. One is if you look at integrated employment, the green section on the bottom, we had good growth from about 1990, which was early in the supported employment systems change effort, to about the year 2000, which was, several years after the last state supported employment systems change grant ended. And then we stalled from 2000 to about 2012, 2013. We are just beginning to see an upturn. There's a meaningful upturn there towards the end between about 2013 and 2017. We actually think that the upturn is a little bigger than that because as the settings rule has been implemented, as states have begun to redefine their services, we're being stricter about what we mean by employment. So we actually think that the improvement is a little better than that. But our real challenge is engaging folks who are in non-work services, rehabilitation, whether community-based or facility-based. The blue section for many years has been our biggest growth area. And having the conversations that Janine talked about and moving away from that is really our biggest challenge. The other piece as we think about what we know nationally is that it's possible to do better. This is a distribution of the percent of people who receive a day service who receive a support to be in integrated employment. It ranges from about 4% on the very far left of this graph to a state on the very far right that's at 86%. And maybe most importantly, a cluster of states, about 6 to 8 states that are at 40% or higher in integrated employment. That suggests that not only can individuals succeed, but that states can really move the bar in terms of engagement and employment as a key outcome, and delivery of employment support as a key service in their systems. Janine?
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about moving employment from state policy to implementation, and there's a lot of excellent work afoot in Utah. I think it's important to really ground us in a couple of the policy influences, the federal policy influences that are out there. We're going to talk a little about the Cms Employment Guidance from that came out in 2011. We're going to talk about very much at a high level the CMS settings rule, where the Department of Justice has stepped foot in the state with regards to employment efforts and or a lack of moving, you know, at a rate that's acceptable for many, many different reasons. We're going to talk about the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, better known as WIOA. And we're going to talk a little bit about state employment first policies across the country. So let's get started on the CMS guidance, because it was a really, really important turning point in states as they continued to try to move the employment agenda forward. But more importantly, it really clarified that pre-vocational services are expected to be time limited, for number one, and focused on teaching and providing supports to people who may have limited work experience, to really focus on identifying skills and interests that would, at the end result, lead them to a competitive job in the community, whether they needed long-term services and supports or not. So the guidance also did a couple other things. It provided individuals with disabilities information about employment services, really by specifying small group supported employment is a pathway to individuals getting jobs, but it is just that. It is a pathway. It is a stepping stone. We want people to move into competitive integrated employment. It added career planning as a service. It really emphasized person-centered planning. Person-centered planning, as you all know, has been around for a very, very long time. If you do it right and it's, you know, really efficient, you really roll your sleeves up and it can get messy. And it was further codified in the CMS Home and Community-Based Services regulation. This bulletin also clarified that volunteering is not paid community employment, and they were really clear on that. So volunteering, again, could be a stepping stone, but it's not considered community employment. It really supported this guidance, the idea of peer support and self-determination. And then lastly, that pre-vocational services are not the end point in people's lives. We're not working on our skills for employment indefinitely. It should be time limited. They did not go as far as saying how long that time period should be, and there are states across the country that put their stake in the road, you know, for a year or 2 years or what have you. But, you know, this really helped this guidance to enforce employment, which was a really important turning point. Also, you have really been engrossed, I'm sure, and your state has been engrossed in the Hcbs final regulations. These home and community-based service regulations are known as the settings rule, and they were finalized on March 17th of 2014. The main focus of these regulations is to, and you can find this in the preamble, it's not my opinion, is to really enhance the quality of home and community-based services, provide additional protections to the people receiving them, and really to ensure that people being supported are receiving full access to the benefits of community living. Some of the tenets on the slide, the setting is chosen by the person, that full integration that I talked about. A key point here in the regulations and included in the person-centered planning section, opportunities to seek employment and work in competitive integrated settings. And then opportunities to engage in community life, control their own resources, and this bar to receive services to the same degree as access of people who are not receiving any type of Medicaid service. So it really highlights the importance of states, as you are, really looking at your service arrays, support coordinators, case managers out there, really understanding your employment service definitions, and really understanding how you can help that person along their employment pathway. I do also want to say about this that all states are in transition. It's their transition time right now because states have to have a transition plan that's approved by CMS by 2022, which we're in 2020. It's right around the corner. Some of the other tenets of this regulation that I really would be remiss if I didn't point out is, you know, it really talks about employment in competitive integrated settings. It focuses and really talks to person-centered planning. If you go into those regulations, there are parameters around person-centered planning that have to be addressed. And then, as I said, states are really taking that opportunity from that CMS 2011 guidance and this rule to reevaluate and revise their services and supports if they need to. I want to talk a little bit about the Department of Justice here because, as you all know, 25 years ago, Congress enacted the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this act prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in employment and, quite frankly, other aspects of community life. Since then, you know, public policy at all levels of the system, you know, has really demonstrated a growing support for employment of people with disabilities as a shift to promote their independence and full integration in society. With that being said, the Department of Justice partnered with CMS and, you know, to really fulfill those obligations, they looked into the different states, and Rhode Island was the nation's first statewide settlement agreement, really vindicating those civil rights of people with disabilities who are unnecessarily segregated in maybe a sheltered workshop or a facility-based day program. And I think the light that this settlement agreement really shined on is that the state had an over-reliance on segregated settings, whether, like I said, it was a sheltered workshop or a facility-based day program, really to the exclusion of integrated alternatives, such as supported employment or integrated day services. So Rhode Island's been working really, really hard to make changes, but the point being, they had to, you know, really take on the direction of the Department of Justice to make those changes. Similar cases occurred in Oregon of people in sheltered workshops who could and wanted to work in integrated settings. And also you will see on the slide Virginia, Delaware, North Carolina, Georgia, and these were similar in really, I think, concerning the failure to provide services to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the most integrated settings that are appropriate to their needs. Many states, after this happened, before this happened, after WIOA came out, before WIOA came out, initiated employment first policies. You have one in your own state. You know, and the concept of employment first means that employment in the general workforce is the first and definitely the preferred option and outcome in the provision of all publicly funded services for every working age citizen with disabilities. And that is regardless of their disability. If we really take a look across the country at state employment first policies, 38 states have an official policy right now. 17 of the states have passed state legislation about employment first. most of the other states have either a policy issued by the state or an executive order or a memorandum of understanding. And 21 of the states have policies that cross disability. So they're not only IDD specific. They cross all disabilities. John, I think I'm turning it over to you.
Yep, and I just want to highlight a couple of things that impact your work from the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act of 2014. I'm going to skip a couple of slides that have detail on them, but want to emphasize three things. First, WIOA gave us a stricter and clearer definition of competitive integrated employment, and it supports some of what you see in the Medicaid policy that Janine covered, but it provides us some guidance about the clearly preferred outcome of the supports that we provide. We'll come back to that in a second. Second, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act put a stake in the ground on transition, and you may see your voc rehab system in Utah more engaged with schools, more engaged with transition age youth and young adults. They're required to spend 15% of their state VR funds on supporting what's called pre-employment transition services. And then the last thing that you should be seeing, and that is a real opportunity for those of us who are more on the IDD service system side of things, there's a part of that act called Section 511 that creates restrictions on people's participation in sub-minimum wage employment. More specifically, for young adults who are 24 and under, there's a process people need to go through and a waiting period where they have an experience with pre-employment transition services, a referral to vocational rehabilitation takes place, and they have a chance to receive counseling about alternatives to sub-minimum wage employment. For people who are earning sub-minimum wage employment, there's now a requirement that people receive annual career counseling, and in addition to counseling about competitive integrated employment opportunities, information about self-determination and access to self-determination training. Your vocational rehabilitation agency is responsible for managing that process. They may or may not be directly providing those counseling sessions. And finally, schools are no longer permitted to provide, to have contracts that involve people working at sub-minimum wage. So school age youth and young adults are no longer permitted to work in sub-minimum wage situations with funding from a school district. This definition of competitive integrated employment influences all of our work, but is specific to the preferred outcome for the voc rehab system. So it's defined as full-time or part-time work at minimum wage or higher, wages and benefits similar to those without disabilities, performing the same work, and that the person be fully integrated with coworkers without disabilities. At a location typically found in the community, and that the job is like other people's jobs. The person interacts for the purpose of performing job duties with other employees as appropriate, customers and vendors to the same extent as employees who are not individuals with disabilities. This fairly strict definition has led voc rehab agencies in many cases to restrict the kinds of placements that they support for individuals. And in many cases, placement into things like group supported employment is no longer considered a successful vocational rehabilitation closure. And it's really made us rethink what our goal is and what that gold star for an employment outcome is. So what does this all mean to you? Career counseling through VR is a requirement for people who are working in sub-minimum wage employment at least annually, with additional requirements for people who are 24 and under. It gives you an opportunity to follow up and discuss work options with people because this is a mandatory conversation and we can piggyback on that. And it provides an opportunity to collaborate more closely with VR. John McKnight, who is not so much about disability, but about building communities, said that our goal should be clear. We're seeking nothing less than a life surrounded by the richness and diversity of community, a collective life, a common life, and an everyday life. So it's been our privilege to spend this first of several sessions with you guys. We are open to questions and conversations. So if people have questions about particularly this dense policy stuff that influences our work, but all really indexes back to the values that underlie home and community-based services and what the people we support are asking for as they work with us. I'm going to move us to a brief evaluation screen. In the middle top of the screen, there's also a place to download those resources that you saw at the beginning. Again, you can highlight them and download, or at the very top, that little box with lines and an arrow gives you an opportunity to download all of them as a bundle. We appreciate you hanging with us a little longer. We had a little bit crossed wires about what our end time was today, and we started pretty close to on time, so I can't really blame that. But we went a little longer than what I think you were expecting. We apologize for that, and thanks. Feel free to provide comments, feedback, questions. We'd be happy to have some dialogue.
Thanks so much, John and Janine and Angie. While people are typing in the chat box, I just want to let you know, and you'll also be getting an email reminder. The next module is on February 27th from 10:30 to noon. We're going to go ahead and plan on these being 90 minutes. I apologize as well. So module 2 is having the employment conversation. Thank you so much. Looks like a few people are typing. I'm not sure if there are questions or just comments, but we'll stay on.
And I think, Angie, it's Janine. I mean, Tricia, it's Janine. I would just say to everyone that, as John said, we provided a lot of dense information about policy and practice. And the second module will be really delving in with you about conversations and pathways to employment and how you identify where the person is on their pathway, and really how to build and go into a little bit detail on how to have those employment conversations that I alluded to, you know, using different questions and tools, and especially the SELN Pathway to Employment document to gauge a person's interest and progress towards employment, to help that person explore employment opportunities. So it'll be a lot different content for this next round, more engaging on your day-to-day work.
We'll leave this open for just a little bit if people want to continue to add some comments or download things, but otherwise, have a great rest of the day, folks.
Take care, everybody.